At 10:40 at night, I watched the chief executive, Vivian Ashcroft, look at Caleb Danner. The way people look at a man who is trying very hard to make himself seem important. He had just warned her that the number 4 press line was showing abnormal vibration and needed a stop for inspection. And she told him coldly to pack up his tools and go home early. Caleb did not argue. He set his signed maintenance record on the control desk, took his jacket, and walked out. 1 hour later, alarms rang across the plant. Before midnight, every line stood completely still. If you enjoy stories where the man everyone underestimated turns everything around, subscribe and follow Caleb to the very end. I have spent enough nights inside places like Ashcroft Motion Systems to know that a factory has a voice, and that voice tells the truth long before any spreadsheet does. The plant sat on 80 acres of flat Ohio ground outside a town whose name most people only ever saw on a highway exit sign, and it made precision drive components for machines that other machines depended on. In the last week of that fiscal quarter, the whole building was running at something close to full capacity, chasing a single order worth tens of millions of dollars for a customer whose name appeared in every board presentation, like a prayer. Truck staged in the yard from early afternoon. The shipping dock lights burned white through the dark. Every hour of that week had a number attached to it, and every number was being watched by people who had never once touched the equipment that produced it. Caleb Danner had worked inside that building for more than 10 years, and in all that time he had never once appeared in a leadership photograph. He was the reliability maintenance lead on nights, 42 years old, with gray coming in at his temples and a work jacket so old the company logo on the chest had faded into a ghost of itself. His hands usually carried a thin film of machine oil that never fully washed out from under his nails. He spoke rarely, and when he did, he said less than he knew, which is a habit that makes some men look slow and makes other men look dangerous. Among the technicians, he was famous for something almost impossible: to put on a performance review, which was the ability to notice when a machine changed its mind about how it wanted to run. I knew the reason he took the night shift, though very few people in that building did. He had a daughter, 14 years old, and he arranged his hours so that he could be home in the morning when she left for school, and present on the weekends when she needed a ride, a signature, or someone to sit across a kitchen table and pretend the eggs were good. Her mother had been gone for 6 years, and the arrangement Caleb built out of the wreckage was simple and unglamorous. He worked the hardest hours in the building because those hours bought him a stable, ordinary life for one teenager who would never fully understand what they cost. He did not talk about it. He did not use it as an excuse or an explanation. He simply showed up. The night everything broke, Vivian Ashcroft came to the plant personally to oversee what corporate had branded the production sprint. She was the new chief executive of the company, 36 years old, from a family whose money had been old before the interstate system existed, and she moved through the world with the clean certainty of who had never had to wonder whether a decision would cost her anything. She arrived with a group of managers in tailored suits and polished shoes, walking the main aisle in a tight formation that made the floor feel less like a shift and more like an inspection. Operators straightened up as she passed. Supervisors found reasons to hold clipboards, The building's ordinary rhythm developed a small, nervous hitch that anyone who had worked there long enough could feel in the soles of their feet. Caleb was coming off the mezzanine stairs with a vibration meter in his hand when the group crossed his path, and he did what he always did, which was nod and say good evening in a voice that expected nothing back. Vivian's eyes went to the name patch on his chest, held there for perhaps a second and a half, and then moved past him to Evan Rourke. Rourke, the plant director, walking half a step behind her right shoulder. "Maintenance," she said. And it was not really a question, more a category being confirmed and filed. She did not wait for Evan to answer. She kept walking, and her people followed, and the small moment closed behind them like water. I watched Caleb stand there for a breath, then continue down the stairs toward the presses. And from that instant forward, the shape of the entire night was already set. Because in Vivian Ashcroft's mind, he was a man who fixed things, and could be replaced by any other man who fixed things. Early in the shift, before the first, Caleb noticed something small enough that no instrument had yet decided to care about it. The cooling circulation unit, serving line 4, had developed a slight change in its behavior, a hesitation in its rhythm that would have meant nothing to anyone standing 3 feet away. Nothing had failed. The machine was running. The parts coming off it were within tolerance. And the output numbers on the big board above the floor were beautiful, the kind of numbers that get printed and passed upward. That is exactly what makes this kind of problem so dangerous, because a failure that announces itself early is a failure that can be handled cheaply, and a failure that hides inside good production numbers is a failure that gets to choose its own moment. He pulled the readings and stood there reading them the way other men read weather. The vibration amplitude at the coupling assembly was climbing, not sharply, but on a curve that did not flatten out the way ordinary thermal expansion would. Bearing temperature was drifting up and then correcting, in a pattern that suggested something was being asked to carry a load slightly out of line with its own center. Coolant pressure lost stability for a few seconds in every cycle, and then recovered. Any one of those things alone was noise. All 3 of them together, moving in the same direction, on the same assembly, was a sentence being spelled out, one letter at a time. Caleb went into the maintenance history because he had never trusted his ears alone, and what he found there was the part of the story that later made the lawyers go quiet. That coupling had been flagged for replacement twice during preventive maintenance reviews in the previous 9 months. Both times the work order had been written properly, scheduled properly, and both times the scheduled window had been pushed back to protect production hours. The second deferral carried a note about protecting quarterly throughput. The replacement part itself had been sitting in the storeroom for over 4 months, still in its box, with a bin location and a part number, and absolutely nothing wrong with it, except that nobody had been permitted to install it. So, he did the only thing that his job actually authorized him to do, which was write it down formally and ask for time. He opened a maintenance ticket and set it at high priority, and in the body of it he laid out the request in 4 plain steps. Stop line 4 for approximately 45 minutes. Open and inspect the coupling assembly. Install the spare unit already held in stores. Run a verification before releasing the line back to production. The math was not complicated. 45 minutes of controlled downtime, taken at a moment of his own choosing, would cost the company a known and modest amount of output. And it would remove the only variable in the building that was currently getting worse instead of better. Evan Rourke found him at the ticket terminal 15 minutes later, and I could see the man's whole body arguing with itself before he opened his mouth. Evan was not cruel and he was not stupid. He was simply a plant director who had received a direct instruction from a chief executive standing 200 feet away, and that instruction had been unambiguous, which was that there would be no unscheduled downtime before the night shipment cleared the dock. He asked Caleb whether this could wait until the morning shift, when the sprint pressure would be off, and the ticket could be handled without anybody's name attached to a stopped line. He said it almost gently. He said it like a man asking for a personal favor rather than a plant director overruling a reliability lead. Caleb told him no. And then he explained why in the flattest possible language, because he had learned long ago that urgency in his voice made managers listen to the voice instead of the facts. He said this was not yet a dangerous situation, and that nobody was going to get hurt in the next hour. He said the machine would probably keep making good parts for a while. Then he said the thing that mattered, which was that if the coupling continued to lose alignment, the protective interlock system would eventually detect the resulting loss of coolant pressure and shut the entire line down by itself, without asking anyone's permission and without any regard for what time the trucks were supposed to leave. 45 minutes now, chosen by people, or an unknown number of hours later, chosen by the machine. Evan stood there with his hand on the back of a chair, and I watched him weigh a real risk against a real chief executive, and I watched him decide that the chief executive was closer. He said he would take it upstairs. What he meant was that he needed someone else to own the decision. Caleb did not lower the priority on the ticket, and that refusal, more than anything he said out loud, was what turned a maintenance disagreement into a confrontation, because a high-priority ticket in that system generated notifications that reached the plant leadership dashboard automatically. The problem was now written down where people who outranked everybody could see it. And once a thing is written down, somebody has to answer for it. The conference room on the mezzanine had a glass wall that looked down over the main floor, and Vivian had made it her command post for the week. She stood at that glass, with a tablet in her hand, watching the live production dashboard, and from that height, the plant looked exactly like the thing she believed it to be, which was a system of inputs and outputs with a dollar figure attached to every minute. When Evan brought the ticket to her attention, she did not ask him to summarize it. She told him to bring the man up. That was the first time she had asked for Caleb Danner by function rather than by name, and she still did not use his name when he came through the door. Caleb came up the stairs in his work clothes, wiped his hands once on a rag before he entered, and stood at the end of the table rather than sitting down. He presented what he had in under 2 minutes without adjectives. Vibration, amplitude climbing on a consistent curve. Bearing temperature drifting outside its normal band and correcting. Coolant pressure destabilizing briefly in every cycle. A coupling with a documented history of 2 deferred replacements and a spare part already in the building. 45 minutes of planned downtime now, at an estimated production cost he had already calculated, against the risk of an uncontrolled shutdown whose cost he could not calculate, because it depended on how much secondary damage occurred first. Vivian let a silence sit in the room for a moment, and then she asked her questions in the tone of a woman who already knew where they led. Is the machine currently running? Yes. Are we producing defective parts? Not yet. Has the system generated any shutdown warning? Not yet. Each answer landed the way she wanted it to land, and I could see the other managers around the table quietly rearranging their faces to agree with her. Because that is what happens in a room where one person holds all the authority and everybody else holds a job. She leaned back in her chair with the tablet flat against her knee. What she saw was a maintenance man asking her to stop a line that generated several $100,000 an hour during the most financially visible week of the year, on the strength of a sound and a slope on a graph. She said as much. She said that she had noticed a pattern in long-tenured maintenance staff, a tendency for men who had spent enough years listening to a building to start believing they owned it, and that a machine making a noise did not transfer authority from the people responsible for the business to the people responsible for the grease. She delivered it evenly, almost pleasantly, which made it worse. Two of the managers laughed, quietly, the way people laugh when they are not sure whether they are allowed to. Caleb did not react. His face did not change, and his hands stayed still. And I want to be precise about this, because it is the hinge of everything that followed. He was not being noble. He was being careful. He had been in enough of these rooms to know that the moment he raised his voice, the conversation would stop being about the coupling and start being about his attitude, and he needed the conversation to stay about the coupling. So he waited until she was finished, and then he said one sentence, which was that if she wanted the line to keep running, he needed it recorded that he had recommended an inspection. That sentence changed the temperature of the room instantly. Vivian understood exactly what it meant, because she was not a fool, and what it meant was that this man in the oil-stained jacket had just created a document that would outlive the conversation. He was not threatening her. He was doing something far more inconvenient, which was refusing to let a decision be made in a place where it could later be denied. She set the tablet down on the table with a small, sharp click. "Are you repairing machines?" she asked him, "or are you running the company, Mr. Danner?" It was the first time she had used his name all week. Caleb answered that he was trying to keep the machines running, which happened to be the literal and complete truth. Vivian told him that in that case he should let the people who ran the company decide when it stopped. She said it with finality, the way a gavel comes down, and she looked back toward the glass and the dashboard beyond it, as though the matter had already been filed away. Evan Rourke stared at a point on the table. Caleb thanked her, which surprised everyone, and went back down the stairs to the floor. Behind him, without any discussion at all, the priority level on his maintenance ticket was quietly changed from high to routine. Here is the part that people who tell this story usually get wrong, because it is less dramatic than the version they prefer. Caleb did not go back down to the floor to sulk, and he did not go back down to build a case. He went back down and spent the next 90 minutes preparing for a failure he had just been forbidden to prevent, which is the single most professional thing I have ever watched a human being do. He pulled the spare coupling assembly from stores and staged it on a cart beside line 4, still boxed, with the part number facing outward where anyone could read it. He laid out the specific tools required for the replacement on the cart's lower shelf, in order of use. Then he printed the isolation procedure, the step-by-step sequence for safely de-energizing and locking out that section of the line, and clipped it to the cart in a plastic sleeve, so that it would survive being handled with wet gloves. He wrote a short note at the top in block letters, listing the 3 readings the operators should watch, and the threshold at which they should call for help regardless of what anyone upstairs had said. He walked the night crew through it. He was not organizing a mutiny. He was making sure that if the thing he expected to happen actually happened, the people standing closest to it would not be standing there empty-handed. At midnight, trying to find a part number. At 10:30, Vivienne came down to the floor. She wanted to see the shipment staging area with her own eyes, and her route took her along the main aisle, past line 4, and there she found Caleb Danner crouched beside the machine with a meter in his hand, taking one more reading. I watched her stop walking. I watched her interpret it, and the interpretation she chose was the one that flattered her least, and cost the company the most, because in her mind this was no longer caution. This was a man who had been told no in front of witnesses, and had decided to keep working the problem anyway. This was defiance wearing a hard hat. Evan was with her. So was Nora Bell, a senior operator with 19 years in that building, and a face that had long ago stopped hiding what she thought. 2 shift supervisors stood within easy earshot. In front of all of them, Vivienne asked Caleb whether he was attempting to demonstrate that the chief executive did not understand her own factory. She asked it clearly, at conversational volume, with the machines loud enough that people leaned in to hear the answer. Caleb stood up, set the meter down on the rail, and told her no. He said he wanted the people working the shift to know what to do if vibration crossed the limit. I have thought about her response many times since. She smiled without warmth and said that in her experience, men like him had a particular talent, which was turning a $10 problem into a $10,000 meeting so they could feel necessary. She said it into the small pocket of silence between machine cycles, so that it carried. Nora's jaw tightened. One of the supervisors looked at his boots. And Caleb, who had been called worse by better, simply stood there and let it pass through him, because he had one thing left he was trying to protect, and it was not his pride. It was the readiness of the crew that would still be standing on that floor after he left. Then Vivienne gave the order that ended the argument and started the disaster. She told him he had done more than enough for one evening, that he should clock out and go home. Evan Rourke actually made a sound, a small involuntary noise of objection, because the reliability maintenance lead was scheduled and assigned through the end of shift, and sending him home during a production sprint made no operational sense whatsoever. Caleb looked at her for a moment, not defiantly, just checking. "Are you asking me to leave my shift?" he said. Vivienne answered that she was not asking. 4 words, and the building's most experienced set of eyes was removed from the floor. He did not beg, and he did not argue. He walked to the workstation, completed the shift handover entries, and signed them. He printed the current maintenance report, the one containing the vibration trend, the temperature drift, the pressure instability, the deferral history, and his written recommendation, and he laid it flat on the workstation surface, where the night supervisor would see it. He told Nora where the staged cart was and what was on it. Then he took his jacket off the hook, walked out through the personnel door into the parking lot, and badged out at approximately 10:45. Behind him, Vivian turned to Evan and said that this plant had existed before Caleb Danner and would exist after him. For the first hour after he left, everything in that building appeared to prove her right. And I want to be honest about how convincing it was. The production dashboard climbed. The shipment staging count rose steadily toward its target. Line 4 kept turning out parts that passed inspection, one after another, in the smooth, mechanical indifference that machines maintain right up until the instant they stop maintaining it. Vivian stood at the mezzanine glass with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand and watched the numbers rise, and at some point she remarked to the managers around her that Line 4 was a useful example of not letting emotion interfere with performance. Down on the floor, Nora Bell was not watching the dashboard. She was watching the local display at the Line 4 control station, and at 11:22, she saw the vibration reading jump to a level she had never personally seen on that machine. It did not drift up, it stepped. She watched the coolant loop pressure begin oscillating in a wider band, dropping and recovering, with the recoveries getting shallower each time. She called Evan on the radio and told him in plain language that the numbers on Line 4 were no longer behaving, and that she wanted authorization to reduce the line rate immediately to take load off the assembly. Evan came down. He looked at the display for perhaps 40 seconds, and to his credit, he did not need convincing. He went straight up to the mezzanine and asked Vivian for permission to run Line 4 at reduced capacity for the remainder of the shipment window, which would have cost output, but might have bought the coupling enough margin to survive until morning. Vivian refused. The trucks were scheduled to close out in under an hour. Reducing the rate now would mean missing the window, and missing the window meant a conversation with the customer. And a conversation with the customer meant her first quarter as chief executive would be defined by an explanation instead of a result. She told him to hold the rate. At 11:38, the first automated warning appeared, a yellow condition flag on the cooling circulation unit, serving Line 4. At 11:41, the control system escalated on its own and moved that section into protective mode, throttling back and posting a red advisory. At 11:43, the coupling lost enough concentricity that the coolant pressure fell below the protection threshold and stayed there, and at that point nothing in the building cared anymore what anyone in the conference room wanted. The interlock fired exactly as it designed to fire 20 years earlier by engineers who had never met Vivian Ashcroft and had correctly assumed that someone like her would eventually exist. Line 4 stopped. Not slowed, not paused, stopped. With the hard finality of a system that has decided the humans have forfeited their turn. The upstream stations detected the loss of downstream capacity within seconds and began transitioning to safe stop in sequence, one after another, the way a row of lights goes out down a long corridor. There was no accident. Nobody was hurt. No material was thrown. Nothing burned. Nothing failed catastrophically in the way that ends careers and starts investigations for reasons far worse than money. The protection system did precisely what it existed to do, which was to spend money in order to not spend lives. What I remember most is the sound, or rather, the absence of it. A plant like that produces a continuous physical noise you stop hearing after your first week. A pressure against the eardrums that the body accepts as the shape of the world. It went away in stages over about 90 seconds, and then it was gone completely. And 80,000 square feet of sheet of machinery stood in a silence so total that people could hear the ventilation fans and their own breathing and, from somewhere near the dock, a radio playing music that nobody had noticed all night. Operators stood at their stations with their hands still raised toward controls that no longer did anything. Nobody spoke. The silence was worse than any alarm. Up on the mezzanine, Vivienne Ashcroft watched the production board. One cell went red, then 3. Then the entire primary production area turned over, section by section, until the header line at the top of the display resolved into 2 words and a number that she would see behind her eyelids for the rest of her professional life. Factory output, 0. The clock in the corner of the screen read 11:44. She had sent the plant's reliability lead home 59 minutes earlier, and the building he had warned her about had gone dark before the day he was fired from even ended. Her first instruction was to restart line 4, delivered in the crisp tone of an executive who believes that stopped things can be started by being told to start. The night maintenance supervisor, a man named Doyle who had been in that building since before the mezzanine was built, explained to her that this was not possible. A protective interlock cannot simply be reset. The system had locked out because a defined safety parameter had been violated, and before anything could be cleared, the cause of the coolant pressure loss had to be identified, corrected, and verified, or the interlock would either refuse to release or release into a condition that would destroy the assembly for real. He said it patiently. He said it twice. She asked who was responsible for reliability on this shift. The question sat in the room and nobody answered it. Evan Rourke looked at the floor. The 2 supervisors who had laughed earlier found other places for their eyes. And then Nora Bell, who had come up the stairs uninvited and was standing in the doorway with her gloves still on, looked directly at Vivienne and said one word, which was his name, turned into a question. Caleb. Vivian's mouth opened slightly and did not immediately produce anything. Nora said the rest of it, flatly, without cruelty, which somehow made it land harder. You sent him home. The first call went out at 11:52. Vivian made it herself, and she made it in the voice of an executive issuing instructions, which was a mistake so large it is almost admirable. Caleb was at his kitchen table with a glass of water, and the television off, still in his work pants, because he had not been able to make himself go upstairs. He listened without interrupting while she described the condition of the line, the interlock state, and what she wanted, which was for him to talk the crew through bypassing the protection so that they could restore output and recover the shipment window. He said no. He said it once and then he explained it, which took about a minute. Bypassing an active protective interlock over the telephone on a machine with a known mechanical fault and no confirmed root cause violated the company's own lockout procedure, the equipment manufacturer's operating limits, and, quite probably, several conditions of the plant's insurance coverage. More importantly, he told her, the interlock had tripped because something inside that assembly was physically out of alignment, and running it in that state would turn a component replacement into a machine rebuild. He did not raise his voice. He offered to walk the on-site site team through the diagnostic sequence instead, which was a legitimate thing he could do, from a kitchen table. Vivian's control slipped for the first time that night. She asked him whether he knew what was happening, and there was an accusation buried inside the question, the beginning of a theory in which a man who predicts a failure is somehow responsible for it. Caleb answered that he had written it in the report. That was all. 4 words. He did not say that he had warned her. He did not say that the report was sitting on the workstation, 12 feet from where she was standing, and he did not say anything at all about being sent home. The absence of triumph in his voice was more humiliating to her than any accusation could have been, because it left her alone in the room with what she had done. While that call was still going, a technician named Rusk was doing what technicians do in a crisis, which is look for anything useful, and he found the cart. It was exactly where Caleb had staged it, beside line 4, with the boxed replacement coupling on top, the correct tools laid out in sequence on the shelf below, and the isolation procedure clipped in its plastic sleeve with 3 readings and a threshold, written across the top in block capitals. Rusk called it out across the floor, and people came over to look at it, and I watched the understanding move through that group of exhausted men and women like a change in air pressure. Vivian came down and saw it too, and this was the moment the night stopped being an operational problem and became something she could not delegate. She had spent the evening constructing a version of Caleb Danner in which he was a self-important obstructionist who wanted a stopped line so he could feel necessary. The cart destroyed that version completely, because a man who wants the plant to fail does not stage the repair parts, lay out the tools, print the procedure, and brief the crew before walking out the door. He had not prepared to be proven right. He had prepared to save the machine on behalf of people who had just publicly humiliated him, using his own last hour on the clock, knowing he would not be there to get credit for it. And here is the cruelty of the timing, which nobody in that building failed to understand. The cart was ready for the repair. Caleb had proposed, at 9 o'clock, a 45-minute controlled intervention on a machine that was still under human authority. That job no longer existed. What existed now was a protective shutdown with an unknown amount of secondary damage inside the assembly, a full lockout sequence, a required root cause determination, a manufacturer notification because the interlock had fired, and a staged restart across every upstream station that had gone to safe stop. The 45 minutes Vivienne had refused to spend had already cost her more than 4 hours, and the counting had barely started. By 1 in the morning, the incident had left the building. A stopped line during the final week of the quarter, on a strategic order with contractual delivery terms, is not a plant problem, and the notifications climbed the corporate ladder automatically, while people were still standing on the floor in their protective glasses. Julian Whitmore, chairman of the board, joined an emergency call from his home with the corporate operations chief already on the line. The equipment manufacturer, contacted under the terms of the service agreement because a protective interlock event had been logged, dispatched a field engineer named Graham Pike, who arrived at 2:20 in a rental car with a laptop bag and the specific unhurried calm of a man who has seen this exact night in 11 other states. Vivian moved to control the story, and I will say this for her, she moved fast. On the call, she described the event as a mechanical failure compounded by a communication breakdown, and she said that the maintenance team had failed to convey the severity of the condition to plant leadership. Then, in a sentence constructed with real care, she noted that the reliability lead had left the facility shortly before the incident occurred. She did not say he was sent home. She did not say she had ordered it. She simply placed his departure next to the failure and let the two facts lean against each other. And anyone listening on that call who did not know better would have heard a man abandoning his post. Nora Bell was in the room. She had not been invited, but 19 years of seniority and a badge that opened the door had put her there. And I watched her physically react to that sentence, a sharp turn of the head and an intake of breath. Evan Rourke saw it too, and made a small warning gesture with his hand, and she did not speak. But the expression on her face became a permanent fixture in that room for the next several hours. Some things do not need to be said out loud, to be entered into evidence. Everybody present understood that the senior operator on line 4 had heard something she considered a lie. Graham Pike, meanwhile, was doing what field engineers always do first, which is not talk to anyone. He connected to the equipment controller and pulled the event history, and then he pulled the maintenance management records, and he read them in order, in silence, for about 20 minutes. What he found was a ticket opened at 9:06 that evening by C. Danner, reliability maintenance lead, containing vibration trend data, bearing temperature logs, coolant pressure readings, and a written recommendation for a 45-minute inspection and component replacement, with the storeroom bin location for the spare part included in the body of the text. He kept pulling. The ticket had been opened at high priority. At 9:51, the priority had been reduced to routine, and the system, being a system, had recorded the user account that made the change. It was Evan Rourke. Graham asked him about it, directly, in front of the corporate operations chief, in the mild tone of a man reading a label out loud. Evan did not lie, and I think that was the moment his career turned toward whatever it became afterward. He said he had been instructed that there would be no unscheduled downtime before the shipment cleared, and when he was asked whether that instruction was documented, he said yes, and forwarded the email. It appeared on the conference room screen at 3:11 in the morning, 4 lines long, time-stamped that afternoon, sent from Vivian Ashcroft to plant leadership. No unscheduled downtime before tonight's shipment clears. The room read it in silence. Julian Whitmore, on the speaker, asked someone to read it aloud, and the corporate operations chief did, and hearing it spoken made it land differently than seeing it. It was not a suggestion. It was not context. It was a written instruction from the chief executive of the company that removed the operational discretion of every person below her, issued hours before a machine with a documented defect destroyed itself for lack of that discretion. Then Graham pulled the badge access log because he wanted the timeline complete, and the timeline finished the argument. Caleb Danner had badged out of the facility at 10:46. The shift handover record showed his signature and completed entries. The maintenance report was still physically sitting on the Line 4 workstation, and someone retrieved it and set it on the conference table, slightly curled at one corner, with his handwriting in the margin. He had not abandoned his post. He had been removed from it by direct order in front of witnesses, and he had spent his last hour on site preparing the crew for the failure he had been forbidden to prevent. Graham Pike looked at the assembled data for a while, and then he asked the question that stopped everything. He did not ask who was responsible, and he did not ask what would happen next. He looked up from the laptop at the room in general, and at nobody in particular, and he asked why this machine was still running. There was no answer. Vivian Ashcroft, who had answered every question put to her that night, with speed and precision, opened her mouth and produced nothing at all. In the silence that followed, I watched her understand that the story she had been building all night had just been read into the record by the equipment itself, and that machines do not care who your family is. At 3:40 in the morning, the corporate safety chief made a formal request, and I want to be exact about the mechanism, because it matters more than any speech anyone could have given. Under the company's own emergency response procedure, a protective interlock event of this classification required that the qualified reliability lead of record for the affected asset participate in the recovery, alongside the manufacturer's field engineer. That was not a favor Vivienne granted. It was not an apology she extended. It was a procedural requirement, invoked by a corporate officer over her head, and it meant that Caleb Danner was coming back into that building on the authority of the company's own rulebook, and not on the authority of the woman who had thrown him out of it. He arrived at 4:05. Nobody applauded, and if you are hoping for that scene, I have to disappoint you, because that is not how these nights go in real buildings. What happened was quieter and much heavier. He came through the personnel door in a clean jacket, and the floor crew, who had watched him leave 6 hours earlier, stopped what they were doing and looked at him, and then looked at Vivienne, and then went back to work. That was all. There was no cheering and no vindication in anybody's face. There was just a room full of exhausted people who now knew exactly what had happened and who had made it happen. Vivienne was standing near the Line 4 control station when he reached it. She said, "So you finally made it," and it came out with the last of the authority she had left in her, an attempt to reassert a hierarchy that had died somewhere around 3 in the morning. Caleb did not respond to it. He did not look at her, and he did not look away from her in any pointed way either. He simply went past her to the equipment, put on his protective gear, and introduced himself to Graham Pike, and asked what the manufacturer's diagnostic sequence recommended before they opened the housing. They worked for the next 3 hours, and it was not dramatic. They used the isolation procedure Caleb had printed and clipped to the cart at 10 in the evening, because it was correct and because it was there. They executed the lockout, verified the de-energized state, opened the coupling housing and removed the assembly, and Graham photographed everything at each stage for the manufacturer's incident file. The maintenance crew, who had been sitting on their hands for 4 hours, waiting for somebody with authority to tell them something true, moved like a different group of people once there was a plan on the table with a name attached to it. The coupling came out at 6:20 in the morning, and it told its own story to anyone who could read it. The wear pattern was asymmetric, concentrated on one side, exactly consistent with a progressive loss of alignment developing over hundreds of operating hours. Graham Pike held it under the work light and traced the scoring with his thumb. And he said, without being asked, that this had been failing for weeks and had entered its final phase somewhere in the last day. Then he said the sentence that went into his report and eventually into a board packet, which was that if this machine had been stopped at the time the ticket was raised, the component could have been replaced before secondary damage occurred to the housing and the shaft seat. Vivian was standing 8 feet away, and she heard all of it. I watched her hear it. And Caleb Danner, who had every conceivable right to turn around at that moment and say one single sentence to her, did not turn around. He was measuring the shaft seat with a dial indicator and writing the reading on a clipboard, and he did not look up, and he did not stop working, and he never mentioned the conference room or the floor or the words she had used in front of Nora Bell and 2 supervisors. He simply did the job in front of the people who had watched her prevent him from doing it 8 hours earlier. Nobody in that building needed him to say anything. The room understood on its own who had been right. Line 4 was repaired, verified, and released back to production at 11:20 on Saturday morning, and the plant came back up in stages over the following 6 hours, station by station, in the reverse of the order it had gone down. The financial damage was substantial. The shipment missed its window and went out 2 days late under a renegotiated schedule. The customer relationship required 3 months and a significant concession to repair, and the total cost of the event ran to a figure that made the 45 minutes look like a rounding error, which, of course, it always had been. But there was no catastrophic equipment loss and no injury, because the protection system had performed exactly as designed, which is the only genuinely good news in the entire story. The internal investigation that followed found something considerably larger than one failed coupling. When the auditors pulled 18 months of preventive maintenance records across all 3 of the company's plants, a pattern emerged that nobody had to interpret because it was simply there in the deferral dates. Scheduled maintenance windows had been pushed back repeatedly in clusters, and the clusters aligned precisely with the final 3 weeks of every fiscal quarter. The instruction came from the top, and it had been consistent since Vivian Ashcroft took the chief executive role, and its effect was to move maintenance cost out of the quarter being reported and into some future quarter that would be somebody's problem later. Caleb had not been the only person to raise a warning. 2 technicians in the Kentucky plant and a reliability engineer in the Tennessee facility had documented similar concerns over that period, and all 3 had been managed into silence by exactly the same mechanism, which was a plant director caught between a written instruction and a machine. What made Caleb's case decisive was not that he was smarter or braver than they were. It was that he had documented his warning more completely than anyone else, timestamped it in a system he did not control, refused to lower its priority in Lune, and then behaved with such total professional consistency afterward that there was no place in the record for anyone to hang a counter-narrative. The board met the following Thursday. Vivian argued, with genuine conviction, that she had been protecting a critical contract during the most important week of the year, that plant leadership had failed to escalate the technical risk with sufficient clarity, and that she had made a defensible judgment on the information available to her. Julian Whitmore listened to all of it. Then he told her that a chief executive does not protect a company by silencing the people who can tell what is about to break, and that the information had been available to her in writing from a man she had ordered out of the building. She was relieved of direct operational authority over all plant activity, pending the board's review of her position. There was no public humiliation and no speech, because corporations do not work that way. Her authority was reduced. Her decisions became subject to review, and a maintenance governance policy permanently removed her ability to do it again. 2 months later, she resigned, citing a desire to focus on the family investment office, in an announcement that mentioned none of this. The last turn belonged to Caleb, and it was not the one anybody expected. Corporate operations offered him the position of regional reliability manager, covering all 3 plants, and the reason given in the offer was not that he had predicted a failure or helped recover a line on a bad night. The reason was that the audit had gone through 10 years of his documentation and found something the company had been sitting on, without knowing it, which was a maintenance record-keeping system built by one man on night shift that was more rigorous, more consistent, and more predictive than anything the corporation had ever purchased. Every warning he had ever raised was in there, properly dated, and most of them had been ignored by people who outranked him. He took the job with one condition written into his acceptance, and eventually into company policy. Maintenance and safety recommendations would be evaluated on the data supporting them, not on the job title of the person who raised them, and any decision to override a documented reliability recommendation would itself be documented, with a name attached. He did not ask for an apology, and he never received one. He did ask for a schedule that let him be home in the mornings, which the company granted at once. And his daughter, who was told almost nothing about any of this, noticed only that her father seemed to be sleeping better. I saw him at line 4 about 6 weeks later, walking the aisle on a Tuesday afternoon with a tablet under his arm. The machine was running clean, the cooling loop steady, the coupling assembly 6 weeks old and behaving exactly the way engineering had promised it would. Nora Bell was at her station, and as he passed, she called out over the noise and asked him whether it sounded better now. Caleb stopped. He stood there for 3 or 4 seconds, with his head slightly turned, listening to the machine the way another man might listen to weather coming in over a field, taking his time about it the way he always had. Then he smiled, which he did not do often, and said that now it did, and he kept walking. The line kept running behind him, and it has kept running since. And the woman who had been so certain that he was a man trying to make himself important eventually had to understand the thing that everyone on that floor had already known for 10 years. which was that he had never wanted the plant to need him. He had only ever wanted the people running it to listen before it was too late.